Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to the Shrewsbury Biscuit podcast. I'm Alex Whiteley, and this is show number 2 of what we've been doing today. And today we're going to be speaking about all things Darwin's Garden and Shropshire Wildlife Trust. Obviously, Darwin got his influences from a garden in Shrewsbury, and today we're going to be talking about that and the events that are going to be going on with the Darwin Festival. And joining me today from Shropshire Wildlife Trust, Alan Hughes, and Sharon, who's given a talk on the festival about Darwin's Garden. Thank you very much for joining me, guys.
Hello, Alex.
Hello.
Good morning. No, good afternoon now. Here
Good
we are.
afternoon.
Afternoon.
Just we got there just in time. Thank you very much for joining me, guys. It's really important that we'd be doing this. And as well, this is us breaking the ice with Shropshire Wildlife Trust. We've been going for a couple of years now, and we haven't worked together yet. So this is a great way to break the ice. So thank you for doing this. And John, we had a great conversation on the phone a few days ago about Shropshire wildlife and how important it is and what you guys do to protect it. Do you want to sort of introduce to people what the Shropshire Wildlife Trust is and what it is you do?
Yeah, okay. So we're a charity, and we are one of 45 wildlife trusts throughout the nation. Most of them are sort of focused on a county. So you've got Shropshire and Cheshire and Staffordshire and things like that. So we only tend to work in those counties, but of course wildlife doesn't stay in those counties. So we do cooperate over things, and our role is about conserving wildlife habitat. We are absolutely not a wildlife rescue. We are all about looking after those wild places where wildlife lives and making sure it's able to thrive. And we do that through we're probably best known for owning nature reserves. So we own places like Earl's Hill, and the Arkle, if you go over towards Telford, and we've got about 40 nature reserves throughout the county. Another very important one in Shrewsbury, which we'll come to shortly. But we also work with community groups. We work with schools, anybody with kids at school. In normal times, our staff have probably gone in and worked with the children, particularly primary age children, and introduced them to the wonderful world of wildlife.
It's really important to sort of understand how to care for your environment, isn't it? Especially with the ever-changing strides in technology, industry, things like this that change around us.
It's yeah, you're absolutely right. It's one of those things. Our job is to try and look after wildlife, but wildlife's everywhere, and we only own a little bit of land, and we can only do a little bit. And so we are always encouraging people to do their bit, whatever that is, whether that's something they can do on their farm, if they're lucky enough to have a farm, in their garden. If they haven't got a garden, they can do something around the house, or they can get involved as volunteers with organizations like ours.
Amazing work. Now, on the read up for the for your event on the Darwin Festival, Sharon, it reads: for many years, Sharon literally lived in Darwin's Garden and became fascinated by its history. Can you tell us more about that? Elaborate sort of what's that about?
Yes, certainly. Of course, I will. I was very fortunate with my husband to spend 13 years living in and restoring, as best we could, the family garden of Charles Darwin, which is situated on the Mount. I think lots of people know and have heard of Charles Darwin, but they automatically assume that everything about him is surrounded at Down House in Kent. But in actual fact, he was born in Shrewsbury and actually at the Mount, and spent most of his formative years there before he went away on the Beagle on that amazing voyage that changed his life and our knowledge of the natural world. So I have a great passion. I don't ever claim to be an expert on Darwin. I wouldn't dream of that. But I do know about that garden. And I've sort of given talks in the past, and John is always managing to persuade me to do just one more. And hence, I'm giving this talk I think next week, talking about the garden itself. I sort of like to think that if Charles Darwin was alive today, he'd be very comfortable with John Hughes. He'd find him a really interesting person. And I think he probably might have been the sort of David Attenborough of our town. He'd be promoting wildlife. He'd be encouraging children to be part of this wonderful world we live in. And I think he'd have been a very good ambassador for the Wildlife Trust. So I think the link between the two of them is really rather special.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
I'm lacking. Do you not think I'm lacking the beard though? That's the problem. Alex has got a better beard than I have. He needs to work on it a little bit more. Get it nice and long.
I did until last week. I had a really big beard, and I got to say, props to Charles Darwin for keeping that big beard, because it's annoying. It's horrible. It's scratchy. It's itchy. It's just oh. So I was just like, I couldn't take it anymore. It was gone.
One year for the Darwin Festival. Gosh, I can't remember when it was. It must have been about 6 or 7 years ago. We got people to make knitted beards.
I remember
we've got
that.
photos. Yeah. And we've got photos of kids wearing knitted beards, Darwin beards, and I think even the park run that takes place in the quarry, we had a load of people wearing knitted beards on the park run.
Amazing.
I think the only problem with that image of Charles Darwin is that you see him as an old man. Mm-hmm. And the wonderful thing about living in Shrewsbury and that amazing garden is the fact that that was where he was a little boy. And part of being a child in that garden influenced him so strongly, I think. I mean, he had the most amazing family background. DNA is everything. And his father was a local doctor. Yeah. His father was Erasmus Darwin from Lichfield. And he was the guy you didn't want to be at school with because he was just brilliant at everything. He was a real polymath. You know, he did everything right. He was a doctor. He was a well-published poet. He was an inventor. He was a member of the Lunar Society. He was a real clever all-rounder. So those sort of genes were passed on to Darwin. And actually, in some of his early work, if you ever go over to Lichfield, it's really worth a visit. It's completely free to go into the house. All the staff there are utterly wonderful. And it's an amazing legacy to Erasmus Darwin. A lot of original artifacts are still in there. But he started his own theory of evolution. But at the time, you couldn't challenge the church. To do that as a doctor who relied for his income on every level from his patients, no NHS, you had patients that paid or you starved. And he had his own theories about evolution, but he had to keep them to himself because the very sort of Christian background of some of his patients would have meant they'd have walked away from him. So I think the start of the theory of evolution started with Erasmus, I'm sure of it. And then on the other side of the family, excuse me, I'm going to cough.
It's okay.
It is a normal cough. And if you look at Susanna, his mother's family, the Wedgwoods, who lived at Etruria, she was educated, which was very rare for a woman at the time. She did an awful lot with plants and botany with her brother, John, who was one of the founder members of the Royal Horticultural Society. And that influence was carried on to when she was in the garden with her plants and growing. And Charles was born into that. He automatically followed the gardeners around the garden. He worked with his mother on sowing seeds. Things were challenged, although they were a religious household. On the mother's side, she was Unitarian, and he was baptized at St. Chad's. The family were challenging. I've got a lovely bit. I'll have to read it off here because I can't remember it all. I think sometimes we forget that Charles was actually quite a naughty little boy. He often bunked off school. I'm sure if we read his report, it would say, could try harder, often goes off into daydreams and spends too long looking outside the window and should apply himself to his Latin. But there's a lovely bit he wrote, and it goes as this. Sometimes I stole fruit for the sake of eating it, and one of my schemes was ingenious. The kitchen garden was generally kept locked in the evening and was surrounded by a high wall. But by the aid of a neighbouring trees, I could easily get onto the coping stone. I then fixed a long stick into the hole at the bottom of a rather large flower pot, and by dragging this upwards, pulled off all the peaches and plums which fell into the pot, and thus the prizes were secured. So he wasn't that daft, was he? So this
Very
dreamy
clever.
little boy who was living in this very wealthy household had opportunities beyond belief to be able to pursue his naturalistic instincts that align with the Wildlife Trust so well. And then, of course, to be able to go on the Beagle and thus start a chain of events would make him one of the most famous men in our country and in the world. When we lived at the garden at the Mount, we owned all the wood and all of the thinking path, the only original bit of the thinking path that was left, and part of the sort of main garden on the front. And we'd often just go out of the front door and we find people just walking around from all over the world, Brazil, Indonesia, everything, but an awful lot of people from India. And I don't do a very good impersonation of an Indian voice, so my sincere apologies. But I remember asking one gentleman why he was there, and he said, well, Darwin is very, 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 very big in India. Very, very big. And that sort of summed it up.
It's crazy to think that this garden was almost responsible for an evolution that spread across the whole world and still is today. That garden was, partly responsible for changing the world. And you talked about his DNA and his family around him as well. That's fascinating to think about. It's really important to sort of keep that restored. So well done for your work and keeping sort of revitalizing that garden to what it was back then. What does the garden look like today? Do you know?
Well, we've moved on. It was
Yeah.
an awful lot to sort of keep on top of, but the house was purchased by two delightful people, both very keen gardeners, and to my knowledge, it probably looks better than when I had it. We did all the back-breaking work because it was in such a mess. The rear of the garden, which overlooked the river, was the base of the vinery, which is where they grew grapes and stored precious sort of heat-sensitive plants. And it's interesting that it was built for Susanna by Robert, her husband. She had just brought in the most enormous dowry into the marriage, probably about, I think, John, didn't we say about £2.3 million in today's money?
Something
And
like that, yes.
she liked grapes. So, of course, what do you do when your wife brings in that sort of money? Well, you build her a vinery and grow the grapes.
Yeah.
So
When your dad is Josiah Wedgwood knocking out pots by the million, he wasn't short of a bob or two, was he?
no, he wasn't. And Susanna was his favourite, his first daughter, and was always thought to be his favourite. So he endowed her very, very well. But the most important thing was he also taught her. He taught her about chemistry and his own process. She learnt French. She was fluent in French. She had a lot of her father's sort of orders from France. And also she was a free thinker. And I think they encouraged that tremendously. And that, I think, was passed on to Charles. And I don't know if you know, please stop me from going on. I feel as though I'm talking and John
No,
isn't getting a word in
this is
edgeways.
beautiful. I love it. I love it.
There's the most amazing garden diaries that are owned by the most wonderful author, Susan Campbell. And if anyone's listening and wants to learn more, you can go online and find her articles. She's just great. And she owns the diary, one's missing. And when we did the programme in the garden with John and the Wildlife Trust for Country File, she trudged all the way up from the south of England on the train with this precious diary. And it was amazing being able to look at it. But every day they wrote something. And if you imagine a very, very large ledger, and on the top you'd have the date something like 1834, and then at the top you'd have the second, well, let's take today's date, it's the 6th of February, February, and then you'd have 1884, 1885, 1886. And each day they went in and turned the page, and on that day they would write something like the cow was sick, or they planted pea seeds. And it gives this snapshot into this garden of all the things they did. But more importantly, it shows the process of recording information that Charles grew up with. And of course, that's exactly what he did on the Beagle. He recorded everything as meticulously as they did in the garden diaries. So again, another influence from the family to train that young mind.
I think that's really that in some ways if you look at what Charles Darwin skills were. He wasn't, as Sharon says, he wasn't terribly academic, certainly as a young man, and he had 3 attempts at going to university, and didn't fare terribly well. But what he was a great observer, so he was able to he learnt. In the garden around Shrewsbury, he learnt to observe things. He got fascinated by the natural world, and he just bothered to look. And I think that that's something that we can relate to at the moment, because we're not able to go out and go up at those wonderful places, that the far flung places. We've got to take our pleasures far more locally, and going out locally, and several people have said this to me, I've seen things I've never noticed before. So people are going out and they're observing, and that's what Charles did. He looked at things, he looked very closely, and then he recorded them, but he then put structure to it. And I think if anything was his great skill, it was observing, recording, and then working out how everything fitted together. And the classic example of that is when he was at the Galapagos. He was looking at the finches that lived on the different islands and the shapes of their beaks, and he recorded this. And it wasn't on the beagle, but later when he came back and mulled over this, he was able to realize that in effect you started off with one bird, and it had evolved to fill whatever the niche was on that particular island, whether its beak was for eating insects, or it was for eating seeds, or it was for getting into flowers. They'd evolved, and he worked that out, and that was his real skill, that observation. And I like that so much, because it's something anybody can do. You don't have to be super intelligent just to stop and look and think and order things.
And that takes us very nice. Oh, sorry, Alex.
No, please carry on, Sharon. Please.
And that takes us very nicely into the thinking path, because the only remaining portion of the thinking path is at the bottom of the back garden at Darwin Gardens. And I didn't really know what it was when we moved there. It was only when a gentleman turned up from English Heritage and explained to us, and it was amazing to think that it was still there. And it's quite well documented that Robert took the boys, not the girls, just the boys. He took the boys on a daily walk, and the walk went out of the rear of the house, often through the window. They didn't use the door very much, that you can actually see a step at the window. If you can go around the back of the Mount House, you can see it there. And they would go out, and then they'd do this walk along the rear of the house, and then down into the wooded area where the upper and lower levels meet. They'd walk round, down to the bottom of the flower garden, up, through and back to the house. But they didn't talk on this walk. The idea was that they thought about what they were going to do that day, and that lovely term, think about the consequences of their actions. And I really love that. And of course, when Darwin moved to Kent with his wife Emma, he replicated this walk. And for years, nobody quite understood why it was called the sand walk. And it's only actually when you go into the wood, which is now owned by the Wildlife Trust, you can see there's an awful lot of sand in there, and you can see where that comes from. And he carried on doing that walk after he'd been on the Beagle and returned and settled in Kent. And I like to think that what John's just talked about with the finches, he'd moulded over in his head on that walk. And there might have been that eureka moment on a particular portion of the walk that went, I've got that. God, why didn't I think about that before? And maybe started to form what he was going to write about. And, Shropshire is such a fantastic county. We have so much geological and natural history. For Charles Darwin, it must have been like the sweetie shop. So many wonderful things to see. And I'm so pleased that the Wildlife Trust is encouraging everybody to look after these areas, trying to buy areas of land and protect them. They really are such a fantastic organisation. And if anyone's listening, I think they should join. I think it's a wonderful thing to do.
Well,
I don't get paid.
that
I don't
saved
get
me a
paid for
job,
promoting.
hasn't it?
I love this, by the way. I love the idea of us taking lessons from Darwin's thinking path. I mean, I've been thinking about it a lot, actually. There's been lots of posts about there's people going out bird watching and stuff now. Life was so busy before COVID, and I'm not saying COVID's great. It's not. Obviously, terrible things are happening. But if we were going to take positives out of what's going on, it's the fact that things have sort of slowed down a bit now. People can go out and they can bird watch and they can enjoy the nature. I've seen some amazing nature shots from across the world, actually. My friend Andy McElfresh in LA, he's taking wildlife shots. I've seen people in Shropshire taking wildlife shots. There's lots going on that people weren't able to do because it was like the hustle and bustle of life is just kind of quieting down a bit now. So the idea,
I think that's really interesting, and I suspect even when you go back into the 19th century, for a local doctor like Robert Darwin, Charles's father, his life would have been bustling. He would have been incredibly busy because it not only was he running his own surgery, he was involved with Millington's Hospital. He was a very astute businessman. He had fingers in lots of pies, and I suspect for him as well, that opportunity to just sort of take a little bit of quiet time and ponder things would have been very important. And this we know that this was there within the Darwin and Wedgwood families. It wasn't something that Robert Darwin came up with. This was something that the families just did, and I think you're absolutely right. It's something we can learn from, and we do. We sort of run around at 1,000 miles an hour, and it's everybody claims to be far too busy to do anything, and the reality is we're not. We make our own luck. We make our own time, don't we? And if we choose to have a little bit of time out to just go and sit within nature, not only will we make better decisions because we'll have thought about the consequences of things, but I think we'll be happier and healthier. And there's so much. So Sharon comes from a health background, and the link between nature and health is phenomenally strong, and I don't think you need to be a trained clinician to realize that. It's obvious, isn't it? You go out for a walk to the top of a hill, or in the woods, and you feel better. Dead simple.
It's interesting because Robert Darwin, as you say, was an amazing man, and quite right that he had fingers in lots of pies and was very, very busy. And I think perhaps the only time he got that R&R time was as he got older and finished working in medicine and sat a lot of his time in the hothouse at the Mount House. And there's some lovely anecdotes in the Darwin papers. It talks about when Charles sends him a banana tree while he's away at the Galapagos to plant in the hothouse. So I imagine him in this lovely sort of wicker chair, all padded up with cushions, with the butler coming in with his cup of tea. And he plants this, or he gets a gardener to plant this banana tree. And in the correspondence back to Charles, there's a lovely bit, and it says, he's named it Don Carlos, which obviously is Charles in Spanish, in honor of you. And he sits underneath it and thinks of you in a similar clime. And I really love that. The thought of my son is probably sitting under a banana tree and I'm going to sit under a banana tree as well. And then they planted two enormous palm trees and they grew all the way up to the roof and it was pretty tall. So they must have been quite vigorous growers, I think, or pretty hardy when they arrived. But I think that might have been the only time that he had to sit back and think of nature. And he'd been quite an aloof father in some ways, but the letters that you see are quite loving and rich with thoughts and observations about the garden and what was happening. Charles said he couldn't wait to get home. He said wherever he'd been in the world, he just wanted to be back in Shrewsbury in that garden because nowhere else was like it anywhere. And that was
There's,
rather
there's
lovely.
there's distinctly an element of absence making the heart grow fonder, I think, isn't there?
I think so.
Because certainly Robert thought Charles was a bit of a waster, didn't he?
He
there's
did.
some
Never going to
lovely.
amount to anything.
Yeah, the only thing
Yeah,
he was interested in was dogs and shooting and hunting. I think the
yeah,
quote is
yeah.
something like that. So he liked playing around, but clearly when once he was a few thousand miles away, it was a little bit different.
I think
I
he
think
was. I think once he got on the Beagle and it became, well, it took a long time for information to ferret back. It's not like we've got this device today and he could show you all the fossils as he was going along, or not fossils, sorry, plants and everything as he was going along. I think he did realise that he did have a talent and did become quite proud of him. But I think initially, where he'd failed at medicine, apparently only saw 2 operations, said he was never going to watch anything like that again. I think he saw an arm being amputated. That was it for him. Didn't think much of theology, really thought that was dreadful. And of course, the other thing was law, but his brother had done law, so there was no point in that. So he was a lost soul, really. But along the way, he found his niche, and let's face it, he didn't make a bad job of it, did he?
No.
Right, we've got time to talk about the Darwin Festival as well. This is all amazing, by the way. I love reflecting on stuff like this because, like I said, we can all learn from it, and it's amazing to learn about our heritage and our history when it comes to Darwin. I mean, like one of the best things I love to do when we would record at the parade where our studio is, which of course Robert Darwin, his heavy links there, is stand on that back car park and just look over the view at the English Bridge and that beautiful view at the back of the parade there, and just think. Just like, I've got this incredibly stressful interview I've got to do. I've got to be on the ball. Let's just disappear for a second and just stare at this view for a bit. That's what I used to love to do, and it's important to do that, I think. The Darwin Festival is obviously upon us next week. How important is it to be part of this festival for you, John, and Wildlife Trust?
Well, we've been part of it since it started, really, and it all sort of harks back to good old John King, who got the thing going just before the bicentenary, and right from day one we got involved because it's all about the stuff that we're interested in, and you know you can as an organisation that's all about nature conservation, you can trace our roots straight back to Charles Darwin. So we've obviously got to be involved, and John ran the festival for a few years, and then we took on the mantle of running the festival for a while, and the bid came along and took it on. But we were always really interested in, and it's exactly as Sharon says, it's not the old man with the beard, it's the young inquisitive young man, um, that we were really interested in. That's sort of what we own. That's what Shrewsbury owns. We don't
Mm-hmm.
all own the old bloke with the beard who sits on that statue outside the library. We actually own the young man, the one who was forming his ideas, and we took that and we always wanted to use that to say, come on kids, let's go and have a look, see if this is going to just get your enthusiasm going. You too, doesn't matter, you don't have to be terribly intellectual, you don't have to be very good at school subjects. You can be a Darwin if you get passionate about something. And I think it was as we've seen, it was this passion, this structure to the way he worked that caused him to be the great man that he was. And anybody can do that. And our aim has always been to find Shrewsbury's next Charles Darwin.
And I do believe it's out there as well. I mean, like I talk about it on the show an awful lot. Is I believe there's something in the river. There's something there. There's something in the Severn that just it creates innovation, and we see it all around us. Especially, I mean, we've seen lots of it during this pandemic. Is people come up with these amazing ideas. The whole world is evolving around us, and that's not the correct term. It's not at all. But like technology is evolving, business is evolving, and the people are coming up with amazing ideas. And I can't help but think it's something something geographical about that. It's something nice to think about, I think.
If it's anything, I think it is this business of Shropshire it's a little bit slower, and I'm not from Shropshire originally. I came here in the 1980s, and with a view to staying 2 or 3 years, and blow me, I'm still blinking here. And there's something about it, and it just grabs you, doesn't it? And it gives you that space to breathe. It gives you that time to think, and I think it's one of those places that you're absolutely right. It does spark thought and innovation and ideas.
Yeah, ideas are
I
great.
think it's just the most amazing county. You can go to each area and find something new everywhere you go. It is quite astonishing. It's the graveyard of ambition, because people move here and they don't leave.
Yes.
And there's
Here
a
we go.
reason for that.
Case in point.
Well, I'm Shropshire born and bred, and I would never leave.
Yeah, I mean, I am Shropshire born and bred. I was born in Shrewsbury, but I only came to Shrewsbury to live sort of 3-4 years ago, and I'm never going anywhere else. I love the place. It's amazing. Someone's ringing my doorbell. Nobody else is here. I'm doing a live show. Okay, let's talk about the Darwin Festival. What you guys are doing? Because Sharon, you're doing a talk on Darwin's Garden. Is this something you do regularly? Is it something you enjoy doing?
Well, I don't mind doing it. I'm happy to do it. I suppose I'm like most people. I get a little bit nervous because I never want to let John down and the trust. I always try to do my best. This is a format this year with Zoom, is it? I think it's...
This is StreamYard. Very similar to Zoom.
I know. I'm awfully sorry. You're StreamYard, but I'm just trying to remember the format it is for the talk.
Yeah, we'll probably do it over Zoom or
Zoom.
which will look very similar to this.
Yes. So this is all very new to me. I haven't evolved as well as Darwin. He would have got the computer system just like that, but I'm still a fountain pen on paper girl. So this is quite out of my comfort zone. But the talk is about the garden. It's about the family and about what happened when they moved there, how the family evolved, how it affected Charles Darwin, and talking about the garden diaries. I hope it will be interesting for people. I've been very fortunate. I've been along to some talks and they've been very well attended. But as I've said before, I'm not a Darwin expert. I can only speak about the garden. But John and I have taken some tours in some pretty atrocious weather. We've been soaked to the skin. In fact, we went on one last year and we would have paid the person who came on the second tour to go away because it was stair rods coming down and we were soaked to the skin.
It was one of the named storms, wasn't it? I forget which one it was. But this is obviously, this year is a bit of an unusual format for us, and typically we have done walks, so we can actually look at places, because so many of the places Sharon will talk about still exist. Some of them are swept away under development. The gardens, the Darwin estate was, what was it, 5 acres, something like that, Sharon?
Oh, more than that, 7 acres.
More. Was it?
Yeah,
was
7
it?
acres.
It was big. I have to say, Sharon did not manage a garden of 7 acres, did you? And
2 acres.
2 acres. It was a couple of acres. But actually, to go out and see the remnants of some of these places that were there, and they are very clearly places that Charles Darwin would have played, would have worked. The outbuildings in particular. There's stories of him and his brother blowing up one of the outbuildings and doing all these things still exist, and you can see them, and the thinking path, which is wonderful. It gives me such a buzz to go and stand on this path where I know full well young Charles would have walked and would have stood. And there's an ice house in the land we acquired off Sharon, and I am fairly certain that would have been such a point along the track that he would have stopped there. And I always like to stop there and just think, I'm in the footsteps of Charles Darwin here,
Yeah, it's
Right,
and
quite
that's
wow.
amazing,
special.
isn't it? I
That's
think
lovely.
I don't know if you remember, there was a gentleman who used to work for the council called Peter Boyd, and he was really very knowledgeable, Scottish roses and Darwin, and he put a proposal forward to the council. Must have been in about 2000, 2001, when my husband and I bought the property, and he suggested that the council bought the house, and I think they missed such an opportunity. They'd have owned the front garden, the wood, the terrace, the thinking path. I mean, what? And if they could acquire the mount, imagine combining it all together. What an amazing tourist attraction that would have made. I don't think the people who bought it off us are prepared to sell it, but I suppose they might. But
But
you know,
it's really, I thought it was. I mean, as I say, I moved to Shropshire in the 1980s, middle of the 1980s, and I never realised for ages and ages that Charles Darwin was born in Shrewsbury. And it took us, I think it was about 2006, 7, and after lots and lots of hard work by John King, that finally we got signs around the town that said birthplace
yes,
of Charles Darwin. The only thing we ever had was a shopping centre, and we know how much Charles Darwin loved going out shopping, don't we? His favourite pastime. But yeah, to have somebody who is of such international renown and not celebrate that is criminal, really. And I really do take my hat off to John King and all the hard work that he put in
yes.
to get the festival up and running.
John
Yeah,
King is going to
he
be
turned
on
up
our
at our
show.
house.
Sorry.
Sorry,
I was going to say John
Harry.
King is coming on our show next. He's going to
Oh,
be
is
on our
he?
Is
show
he?
next one.
Excellent.
Yes, he
Well,
is.
Well,
tell him he's a good fellow. He knows that.
he
He
is
knows I
indeed.
think
Yes.
that.
I must admit, he came out to our house and we couldn't get rid of him. It was in the nicest possible way. He got so excited about Darwin because the previous owners hadn't allowed him into the garden. And he was so excited about everything. And eventually we had to say, well, you've been here 3 hours. I think we'd quite like to go and have our lunch now. So on our first morning there, we were sitting there in our gym jams and a bus came up the drive full of Japanese tourists who got out and came up to the window with cameras. And, you know, trying to be nice British people, we nipped upstairs and got dressed, came downstairs, and they come looking for Darwin. So we made them a cup of tea and gave them what cake and biscuits we'd got. They got in the bus and drove off. But it was
I must admit,
spontaneous.
I have, when it's been open and you could walk in, I've taken my boy up there and gone, this is where Charles Darwin grew up as a baby. This is where he's from. And, you know, just trying to instill that sort of inspiration into him. He was 5 at the time, doesn't understand, but, you know, you could try.
We
But
only opened it 3 or 4 times, I think, but it was just so popular. It was
But
just
it
wonderful.
is, it's but part of the problem is we have this absolute wealth of you can only call them geniuses, Victorian geniuses, I think,
Mm.
and it's astonishing how many amazing people Britain produced in the Victorian era, and I think because of that, Darwin is just one of them, and certainly. I think Sharon's experience is really interesting. How much people from other countries revere Darwin, and
Mm.
we said some bloke on a we used to be some bloke on a £10 note with a beard,
Mm,
not quite sure what he did, but you know he absolutely changed the face of society.
And I think
absolutely.
as long as the Wildlife Trust is involved in the Darwin Festival, I feel quite sure that we will carry on promoting him in a very positive manner. And I think the Wildlife Trust needs, you know, a bit of applause for that. I think they've done a really good job.
And what I'm looking at now, what you guys are seeing is the website, which is where you can go and book tickets to the events that we're talking about. You go to originalshrewsbury.co.uk and you click on the Darwin Festival, and here is a list of all the events that are taking part during the week. You see the dates there. There's John King there. Look. And we have your events here at the bottom. So we have the future of Shropshire. A free question time event for 11 to 24, so that's great that you get people's mind working. I like that. And then living in Darwin's Garden, and say we want to attend Sharon's event, you click on the picture and there's a button there to book a ticket. Very easy, and it's also international, universal, whatever you want to say. Anyone can access this. So that's the best thing about this Darwin Festival this year, is everything is accessible for people all around the world. So if you want to watch this, if you want to get part in it and take part in it, enjoy any of these lectures, it's available to anyone, no matter where you are in the world. So that's beautiful. I love that.
And then when things are back to normal, visit Shrewsbury. Simple as that.
Come to see us.
You will not be disappointed.
Absolutely. Well, you guys have been amazing guests. I've really enjoyed this, and this is exactly what I wanted from this show. Just a nice chinwag, a talk about what inspires us about Darwin and what we love. And Sharon, I would love to invite you back on the biscuit when it's not live, when we can just relax with a cup of tea and have a real long natter about your history and what you love about Darwin's Garden, because I feel like we've covered about 15% of it today. So I'd love
about
to.
five.
five. There we go.
I've got pages of research I've done and on the garden, and it's trying to fit it in with the talk. I think it's going to be about an hour, John, isn't it? Something like an hour, and an hour goes very quickly. But as long as I don't bore people to death, I'll be happy.
No, but this is the thing, isn't it? You're only going to go to this lecture if you really want to go to it. So people that are going to attend are going to really enjoy what they're going to hear. So I have no doubts that people are going to enjoy it.
Sharon is far more expert than she lets on. She'll give a fantastic talk. I recommend it to everybody.
I'm sure it will be amazing.
Thank you, John. It's because I'm free.
Everyone's free at the moment, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Where are you going then? Why can't you be available? What are you doing? It's crazy.
So when somebody rings up at the moment and says, "Can I come on Thursday?" So I'll just go and check the diary, going, "Oh, there's a Waitrose delivery. That's great. I've got something on that day."
Unless you're like me and you agree to do something and then completely forget, like I did the other day with you.
We won't talk about that though. We'll let that
we won't
pass.
talk about that. I felt so bad about it. John, would you like to tell people where they can get in touch with the Wildlife Trust and how they can get involved?
Yeah, so just search for Shropshire Wildlife Trust, and you'll find our website and all the information you could want about wonderful places to visit, how to get involved, what we're up to, and most importantly, how to join us as a member.
Beautiful. Fantastic. I would like to tell people about our website as well before we go. And our website is the shrewsburybiscuitpodcast.co.uk. That's powered by our friends at Web Orchard. If you do need a website, make sure you check out Web Orchard. They're amazing. Thank you so much to everybody for watching today and my amazing guests. You guys have been fantastic. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And make sure you guys check out the Darwin Festival. It's amazing. And you will learn something and you'll enjoy it. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us.
Okay, bye.
Our pleasure.
Catch you guys next.
Bye, everybody.
Peace. Bye.
It's just me now. I'm by myself. I better just log off, don't I? Leave studio.